Hello everyone and welcome to our monthly hazardous webinar series. Today we're going to take a closer look at one of the projects in Natural Hazards Research Australia's research program. That project is Predictions in Public, Understanding the Design, Communication and Dissemination of Predictive Maps. And today we'll be hearing from a three-person panel that will share findings from a work package in that project that provides a quantitative understanding of how community members comprehend and use bushfire maps. And we'll also hear about how those findings are being used in the project and how they can be translated into practice. So my name is Blythe McLennan. I'm one of the team of Node Research Managers at Natural Hazards Research Australia, and I have the pleasure of chairing the webinar today. So while we are meeting virtually today, as we so often do now, we are all joining the webinar from unceded Aboriginal lands. So I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and pay my respects to elders past and present. So please feel free to acknowledge the country you're joining us from today in the Q&A chat box. So for myself, I live and work on beautiful Wurundjeri country in southeastern Victoria. So before I introduce our panelists, I have just a few points of housekeeping for you. So today's panel is going to be recorded, and a link to it and any related presentation materials reports will be made available to you in coming weeks. We'll send those out by email. So please let us know as well during today's webinar if you have any technical problems. You can just pop some information about the problem you're having in the Q&A function that you can access at the bottom of the screen. And we have a team in the background who will help you with troubleshooting any issues. So we'll have time for questions to be answered at the end of the formal panel presentations. So please feel free to add questions into the Q&A panel at any time. And making sure that you specify who your question is for. And we'll get to them and we'll have about 15 minutes at the end for presentations. So I'm now very pleased to introduce today's panelists to you. And I might ask our panelists to pop their cameras on so that people can meet you. Thank you. So first, Dr. Amy Griffin is a senior lecturer in geospatial science at RMIT University School of Science. Amy's area of expertise is in understanding how perceptual, cognitive, and affective processes shape how people work with spatial information, including in the form of maps and other information visualizations. She does empirical work with spatial information users to identify ways to design better maps and other representations of spatial information. So Amy's broadly trained as a geographer and has undertaken applied geospatial research in a range of different domains. This includes, for example, transportation, where she has done work visualizing road and rail interactions for a future with autonomous vehicles. In history, looking at spatiotemporal analysis of Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War. In health geography, looking at impacts of time scarcity on health, land use, and land cover change. And gender inequality, looking at access to international higher education. And of course, Amy also works in the domain of natural hazards. We're also joined today by Paula Dootson. Paula is an associate professor in digital economy at the Queensland University of Technology School of Management. So Paula is a cross-disciplinary researcher in deviant consumer behaviour and digital transformation. So Paula investigates why everyday people engage in deviant and non-compliant behaviour and designs human and digital interventions to encourage people to take more compliant and protective action. So she applies that expertise in, again, like Amy, in a range of different domains. So that includes non-compliance with emergency warnings, as well as tax evasion, non-compliant public record keeping, scam victimisation, copyright infringement, and misinformation. And Paula's research focuses very heavily on providing businesses and policymakers with evidence-based solutions to real-world problems. And because of her extensive research engagement experience, that's seen her be awarded a number or receive a number of awards. Our third panellist is Deana Pullella. Deana is team leader of public information at the Department of Fire and Emergency Services in Western Australia. So Deana's worked in emergency services for 6 years, and she has a keen interest in crisis communications and ensuring the public are well informed during an emergency. So since joining the inaugural public information branch at DFES, She's entrenched herself in all things emergency public information, and that's included championing research, which she has certainly been a part of with this project, also representing DFES at a national scale and forming an integral part of the DFES Next Gen Warnings project, which aims to revolutionise public information in Western Australia. And this is my favourite piece of your bio, Deana. Deana's a lover of a nice warm cuppa, Lego, a good book, and a sour cocktail, but just not all at once. And I'm going to add information like that on my bio now. I've read that because I love it. So we're really lucky to have Deana here as part of this panel to share just how this wonderful and quite large research project will make a difference to fire agency staff and volunteers and to communities around Australia. So I just want to whet your appetite a little bit for this webinar before I hand you over to the panel. So during bushfires, do Australians understand the maps that are shared by agencies well enough to take action to protect their lives and those of their loved ones? The bushfire maps, including incident and fire spread prediction maps, are critical tools to communicate life-saving emergency information to the Australian public during bushfires. However, we do have limited evidence and guidance in existence about the best way to design bushfire predictive maps in particular and how they are used during active bushfires in Australia. So the Predictions in Public project is exploring that terrain. It's one of the first projects funded by the Centre when Natural Hazardous Research Australia was established in 2021, and we're thrilled to share a part of the project's first phase of findings with you today. So the first phase of the project has been completed, and it looked at the current use and understanding of bushfire maps in Australia, so that including both incident warning maps and predictive maps, and used by both agencies and community members. I just wanted also to note I've had the pleasure of being along for the ride with this project, and it's quite a special project in the way it's being undertaken. It's very collaborative, co-designed, and it's quite a multifaceted, complicated piece of research as well. So I want to acknowledge all the people involved in this project for their commitment to that way of working, because it isn't always easy. I want to especially acknowledge the roles of Chloe Begg and Angela Gardner. So Chloe Begg at the CFA in Victoria is a project coordinator for Predictions in Public, and Angela supports Chloe in that role. She's at the Victorian Department of Education and formerly with EMV. So Chloe and Angela work very closely with the research team. The full team includes researchers like Amy from RMIT, QUT, Deakin University, and Swinburne University of Technology. And Chloe, Angela, and the team also work very closely with a large emergency management sector steering committee that Deana is a member of. And I do really want to commend everyone on that committee as well for how actively engaged in a sustained with this project and continue to be with this project. It's really been quite wonderful to see. So it is now my absolute pleasure to hand you over to the panel. So Paul, if you want to bring the slides up, I'll pass you over into the capable hands of Amy to kick us off. Thanks, Amy.
Great, Blythe. Thank you for that introduction. So I'm coming to you today from Wurundjeri country in my office here in Melbourne at RMIT. As Blythe introduced the project, our overall aim in the project is to produce some empirical evidence and to use collaborative processes to contribute to building a design that could be used for public-facing fire spread prediction maps during an emergency. So Blythe has already introduced our project team, which is a large team, and I would second her point that we couldn't do this actually without Chloe and Angie, because there's a lot of cats in the room to herd, and a lot of cats that are doing all kinds of different things and are often off their heads busy in all different kinds of ways. And it's not easy actually sustaining that collaboration over a long period of time, but it has been successful, I think, in large part because of the behind the scenes work that both of those two have done to support this project the whole way through. And to that, I'd also like to add that NHRA has given us some fantastic support alongside this project, in particular in undertaking some of the empirical work that we're talking about today, and that one of our colleagues will talk about in a future upcoming Hazardous webinar in a couple of months' time, where recruiting participants can often be very challenging, and so they've helped us to get access to media interviews and that sort of thing, to publicize the project, to engage people with the work. When we were doing some of this work that we'll tell you about today, it was pouring rain and freezing cold. No one was thinking about fire. So it was really challenging sometimes to get people to participate in the work. So this is a snapshot of people who have been involved on this steering committee. As people have rotated in and out of roles, there have been people who have come on and people who have left the steering committee. But these people have been meeting with us every 2 weeks for 2 years. And that is a really great show of commitment to what they believe this work can produce for everybody who's involved in experiencing bushfires in this country. And we really couldn't do this project in the way that we're doing it without the project steering committee, because they've helped us with tasks like designing the scenarios that we study in the empirical studies. And none of us on the project team are, well, that's not entirely true. Tim is actually a fire behavior analyst, but the rest of us, we aren't emergency sector workers. And so while we have read lots of things in the literature about that, we haven't experienced it ourselves. And so having the real world experience of all of the members of this project steering committee has been a really critical input to trying to produce research that will be usable for the sector. This project is designed in quite a different way. So we can probably all agree that research should be made available for people working in the sector to help support practice and decision making. But the reality of everybody's day-to-day work lives there's a lot of competing priorities and timelines that are different between research teams and emergency management personnel. So the forces that are pulling us in different directions oftentimes lead to limited involvement from end users in research projects. And this is a real key difference on this project. We have not had limited involvement from the end users. We've had really good engagement from that entire steering committee all the way around. And what this is helping us to do is to avoid a situation. I mean, as researchers, we often want to simplify things. We want to only manipulate small amounts of things so that we're sure we understand relationships between variables. But the reality is complicated, right? And so if we simplify things too much from a research perspective, we end up producing things that are not really usable in real life. So this has been kind of a tension in the project all the way along that we've negotiated as the research team, which includes really the steering committee, to try and study how people are working with these maps and reading these maps and understanding these maps in a way that will lead to evidence that is workable and implementable in real world practice, to avoid the situation where we have a massive gap between the research and the practice. So the project has been designed as a collaborative project, as you've heard. It's also been iterative. So we kind of cycle around and come back and forth to the same ideas, learning from one set of studies, implementing what we've learned then before we go into a second study to refine the design over time. And importantly, it's human-centered. So what this means is that we're trying to take into account the public's needs for information, but also the emergency management organizations' needs in terms of producing that information. Because just generating the evidence alone is not sufficient for it to be used. So we're trying to do this in a way that produces information that is workable for the teams who will eventually be publishing these fire spread prediction maps. So we're trying to take that into account. The overall design of the project was in 3 phases. So what we're going to be talking about today is primarily phase 1, some outputs from phase 1. The point of phase 1 was to understand how people actually work with, or how people read, how people use, how they access existing maps of fires. Because if we're going to introduce a new map, a new type of map, a fire spread prediction map, like the one that you can see here at the bottom of the screen, which is one that was issued by New South Wales in the terrible 1920 fire season, which was the first time one of these maps was really issued to the public. We want to avoid a situation where this new map confuses their understanding of old maps. So we needed to understand, how do people actually work with the existing maps that we have to then try and avoid a situation where we have maps that are working at cross purposes. So that's really what Paula is going to tell you about today, some findings from this phase of the study. We then took what we learned about those maps. We developed a whole bunch of map concepts to test in phase 2. And at the very end of this presentation, the webinar, I will come and show you some of those. And we're currently in phase 2. We're undertaking study. We have one study is completed where we tested a bunch of designs. Paula last week just ran some focus groups as part of another study. And in a couple of months' time, I'll be doing some eye tracking work out in WA for another study there. So we'll give you a little preview of that that's coming up. And then phase 3, we'll be taking all of this evidence that we have generated about, how can we best design these maps, and develop some practical outputs that then people who are in agencies making these maps in like for the public, not for research studies, but for the public, to support them in doing that, to build a consistent and well understood design that can be useful for people. So with that, I will be quiet now and let Paula tell you about some of the findings from phase 1.
Thanks so much, Amy. That was a great foundation. So work package 5 was really our first data point across this multi-phase project, where we wanted to get broad scale understanding of how the community comprehended these maps, what shaped their risk perceptions, their emotions, and what action they were ultimately going to take. So it is quantitative, as Blythe said. So it is trying to get the whole nation's view. If you want those rich insights towards some of the findings that we have here, please tune in to Erica Kulagowski on the 17th of September, where she'll present the qualitative interviews that pair really nicely with what findings we had in this work package. So this was an online survey ran with over 3,000 community members in all states and territories. And each community member in that survey saw 2 different maps. So I'm in Queensland, and I would have seen 2 Queensland maps supplied by QFES. And that was done across all states and territories. I will note New South Wales and ACT wanted to test a cross-border map, so they count as one jurisdiction. The 2 maps that we're seeing were incident warning maps, except for one in that New South Wales ACT jurisdiction, where they did an incident warning plus a fire spread prediction map. So we, as Amy mentioned, we did a co-design of the scenario that people saw before they saw the map. I'll show you that on the next slide. And if they saw an incident warning map, they also saw a warning message that would typically accompany a map in practice. So if they saw a map with a watch and act polygon, it came with a watch and act message as well. The only one that didn't come with a message was the fire spread prediction map, because that's how you would use it in practice. So in terms of the scenario, each state presented us with maps that were in different formats. It might have been embedded in a Facebook post, it might have been on their website, but they all came with a scenario that was relevant to that particular area, all hypothetical, all putting the community member, the participant of the survey, in some hot summer day. And they provided a little bit of context around the weather and indicated that you have now sought out more information about a particular bushfire. In this case, you went onto the Emergency WA platform and you looked at this coming map. The first map they saw, this is the WA example, since we have Deana here with us today. They saw a watch and act map, incident warning map, plus that associated message. They were then asked a series of questions around, tell us what you see. Do you comprehend what action it's actually prompting you to take? Do you understand what the purpose of the map is? How risky do you perceive the situation to be? What emotions are you feeling? What actions are you going to take? And then they were offered an opportunity to provide some feedback on the map itself. They were then presented with a second map and asked the same series of questions again. The second map was typically a slightly more complex map. As you can see here, it's not just a watch and act. There's advice, there's emergency warning, there's some other icons being used in there. But again, it was accompanied with a warning message. So who was in the study? Because this is such a large scale study and we did have state territory specific results, please check out the report when it's made available. But just to give you a high level national overview, we had a slightly biased female example. We had approximately 20 to 40% people who had experienced bushfire in the last 5 years. So there was some of the sample with that recent experience. And they did indicate that they were in fact using a map, which is great. How they used it, stay tuned for Erica's seminar. We did note there was around 20% of the sample that had indicated they had modified their home or their property in preparation for this bushfire event, showing that there was some stronger engagement in that preparatory protective action decision-making. So the first series of questions after they saw the map that was relevant to their jurisdiction was, what did you actually see? Do you understand what the purpose of this map is? And we largely found that people understood what the incident warning map was, which makes sense because they see it a lot, especially around those who have had bushfire experience. Plus, agencies have been doing a campaign around the new Australian warning system, so the icons are quite familiar as well. Where there were points of confusion for the incident warning maps was around things like if it contained multiple polygons, which we'll look at an example shortly, or there was comments around it being too detailed or not detailed enough. You can never have the community happy. But some of their points were really important around expecting where they would see a street name or a landmark. And it was also apparent in some of those responses that if people didn't have bushfire experience, they were perhaps not sure what was being asked of them or where the fire might go. So all of those ended up being foundational for what feedback was provided, which I'll share with you shortly. When it came to comprehending the fire spread prediction map, it was quite interesting because only some jurisdictions have actually released these maps before. So some communities were seeing this for the very first time. And so while most did indicate it was showing where the fire had burnt, where it was going, where there was going to be ember attacks, it became apparent that there was some confusion around the purpose of the map. So what I've just put on the slide there is a table showing where people could select as many as they wanted of what was the purpose of this fire spread prediction map. And the frequency in percent is what people selected. But that purpose column is where our agencies actually indicated themselves, this is the purpose of the map. So you can see there is some alignment. Yes, it's to show the level of risk, to show the location of the fire, to show where it is now, to show the threat. But there's still some things that the community selected that was not the intent of the map. And you can see most of them tend to indicate some kind of trying to make it connect with the incident warning map. Where's the emergency warning? You know, it's going to show me a watch, it's going to show me an advice. That could be because maybe they're mistaking the red for being an emergency warning icon there. We don't know. That's something that we've interrogated further in later studies, but it shows that perhaps just because they got the answer right here doesn't necessarily mean that they are totally comprehending the purpose of a fire spread prediction map. When it came to the risk perceptions and negative emotions at a really high level, when we presented the community first with a watch and act, followed by one that was an emergency warning, their risk level tended to increase. They perceive the emergency warning or the more complex map, as you can see on the slide here, as being a more threatening situation. And where they saw higher levels of risk, they also felt worried, anxious, and fear, which is those negative emotions. But there's something really important I want to point out here. So on the slide, you're seeing those two WA maps again. Now that first map was accompanied by a watch and act message. The second map was accompanied by an emergency warning message. That is a natural escalation in severity of the event. So it makes sense intuitively that risk perceptions and negative emotions would increase. However, how much of that is being attributed to the map versus the warning message itself? Well, let's look at another state's example. We had a watch and act message with a watch and act map. Then the second map was more complex. You can see it's added advice and emergency warning, but it was still a watch and act message. And we saw higher risk perceptions in that second map. So that suggests, okay, maybe it's the complexity of the map that's signaling a more severe risky event. However, when we looked at a different variation, we started in this condition with an emergency warning icon as well as the emergency warning message. And then we went to a more complex map, but the warning was watch and act. So in the warnings showing a de-escalation despite the image showing a greater complexity of an event. And now here we saw lower risk perceptions. So in this condition, you might argue that it's the warning message that's driving those risk perceptions, not necessarily the map itself. But those two conflicting results, this slide and this one, suggest there's more to interrogate around how those risk perceptions are informed. And we have more answers from recent work packages. And then we wanted to know, before, what would you do in response to receiving this? We wanted to understand, what do you think it's prompting you to do? And again, as you can see from the slide, this is where we ask both our steering committee to provide a response in the X's there of what is this particular map telling the community to do, and then what the community thought. Now you can see here, there's largely pretty clear alignment. So this is the West Australia map that watch and act. Yes, under a watch and act, you probably want to do those things. So that's great. To some level, you can say, yes, the community understood what actions were needing to be taken there. This is an example where you have a watch and act message that has very clear instructions stipulated in that message. So these results are coming from two places. One, you're a great student, you read the message, you saw the instructions, you ticked the boxes. Or two, you actually indicated what you would do, whether or not you attended to that message. But either way, you've arrived at a similar point. Where this becomes a little bit interesting is when you start to look at them, what action would they intend to take? So we asked, out of a very long list, this was not the complete list, it goes on for like 3 more slides if I'd included the whole image, what were the top 5 actions that you would take after seeing this map and this associated message? And you can see there, it's not a clear drop-off like we saw in the last slide. There's people indicating all kinds of things here. It's great when it aligns with what was actually explicitly stated in the warning message that accompanied the map. But where it became problematic, or where it became interesting and then problematic, was when we saw instructions, people said, I would do this thing. And we were like, okay, that's fine. It wasn't explicitly stated. It might have been implied, and it's pretty general, like I would stay informed by emergency services agencies. Great. That's at least a protective action, despite the warning message maybe not saying it. The next was they indicated they would do a specific action that wasn't mentioned in the message, but it was something that they would do, like maybe the message didn't say prepare your medications, but the respondent said that they would do that. Again, it deviates from what the agency said, but it's still moving in the right direction to being protective. This is where it became problematic, where people started to say things like, I would wait for the police to come, I would wait for a firefighter to knock on my door. And this is where none of that was mentioned, and it is non-protective responses, because you could get people staying back or milling and only responding when it's too late. When we looked at the Fire Threat Prediction Map specifically, and we wanted to interrogate, well, given this is a public information product, not a warning product like the incident warning map, what action are they going to take? Because there's no real intended action here other than the generic stay informed, or perhaps just be aware this is a very bad day, and what are you going to do next? Well, you might go look for its accompanying incident warning map. So some of the responses people said is I would follow emergency instructions, or I would stay informed, which is great. But it was interesting to see that there were still some very specific behaviours that people said they would do after seeing an incident warning map with no warning message attached. Some evacuating property, some preparing to evacuate. So there was more to understand around, does the community actually know what to do, and what do agencies actually want people to do when releasing this product to the community? So as we noted at the beginning, where there were those comprehension issues, there was ultimately feedback provided to us about how we would go forward when designing not just incident warning maps in the future, but really providing a foundation for the design of those fire spread prediction maps. 3 things I want to draw your attention to. There were things around directionality and timing, and that was whether they saw the incident or the fire spread prediction map. And that's actually really interesting and fantastic, because the fire spread prediction map offers that. It's showing where the fire could go, and it's showing that over a time period. So that was really helpful for our later designs of what our fire spread prediction maps were going to look like. When it came down to things like landmarks and routes, that's really helpful in what is the community expecting to see on that map. The interactive capabilities was discussed a lot, especially references to platforms they use like Bushfire.io or the Bureau and how they're familiar with that. And we've got studies interrogating that aspect as well. And then there were comments around accessibility. Can I see this on my phone? Would someone with color blindness be able to actually see these colors? How are we going to be able to utilize this when people have other accessibility issues like language? So Amy's going to talk more about how we use that feedback. But first, I'm going to hand over now to Deana, who can hopefully contextualize not just how DFES have used this particular work package in isolation, but how the project is being utilised more broadly in DFES over in Western Australia. So thanks so much, Deana.
Thank you, Paula and Amy, and thank you for this opportunity to present today. So as Paula said, I come to you from DFES in Western Australia, and I just wanted to give you an overview as to how important this research is to not only our team, but to DFES as an agency. So really the purpose of this, of being involved in activities like this and other research that we undertake as an agency is that it really can back up key decision making. So in our little public information branch, we have a bit of a saying that we don't make big decisions without it being backed by evidence. And I think that's a really good standpoint to come from, because a lot of what we do in the day-to-day sense is quite knee-jerk and can be some type of reactions that can happen based on one incident or something that has occurred that's quite niche. It takes us the effort to stand back and say, well, where is that sort of all coming from? Is that a perception of a small group or a large group? And then how do we have that evidence to make the changes that we are proposing? So I think I just wanted to make that point clear, that the research that we do and the research that we be involved in is so important to help us make those decisions. Just as a personal perspective of mine, when I do go into conversations with operational personnel, I think it's really critical to be backed by that research, because sometimes it's just unknown as to what the community or the public want and need from us. So having that information readily available and having it, arming yourself with that before heading into critical conversations is really important. Also, what we think versus what the public want may be worlds apart. Like I said, there are some instances where you might be in the middle of an incident and you might say, we really need to do X, Y, and Z because that's what the public needs. But then when you actually ask them, it's sometimes quite confronting to go, oh, well, actually, they don't want that. They want this instead. So I think that's why, again, research is very key to understanding what the public wants from us as an agency. Again, just hammering home that point, research should underpin and inform every key decision that we make in public information. And what happens when the topic of risk arises? So as a WA example, there's a lot of pushback with publishing evacuation routes on a map. It's perceived to be of great risk and something that the agency is very hesitant to get into. But when we actually look back at our warnings, we see that we actually already tell people the best way to leave the area. So we're taking that in a text format and we're looking at putting it into a map-based format. So already you can see how critical and powerful a map can be, because people know that when they see it on the map, it's more likely that people are going to act on it. So I just wanted to take you through what we currently have in Emergency WA. which is our state's official source of emergency public information. And Paula, if you do just click through, yep, little arrows will appear. So we do have a layers feature, and we talked about directionality of the hazard. So I know we always say to people, wind direction and speed isn't the only indicator of the way that the fire will travel, but it can be fairly good way to forecast, you know, where it might head next. So as you can see on the right there, we've got a wind direction and speed layer that we have implemented. I think it's about 18 months that we've had that for. And that really has been so well received by the public, because they were able to look at that and go, okay, well, it looks like the wind direction and the speed is heading very, you know, forcefully in a southerly direction. That may then lead you to believe that, you know, that's where the fire is headed next. When you talk about the legend, we do have an icons and a guide at the bottom, and we find that people do access those, or we can then point them to those if we need to. When we talk about issuing, timeframes of issuing and when it's next issued, we also do have some information there on the homepage as to how current the warning is. And then inside the warning, we tell people when to expect an update. And we found that in our own research, people really appreciated understanding how often that warning would be updated. Showing evacuation centres on the map, we've only just started in WA to pull out the evacuation centres and pop them on its own icon on the map. And we find that when that's coupled with the warning, it's very clear as to how people can get to, or what evacuation centres are available for people to access. Interactivity, we do have some handy little buttons on the side. I won't go into that too much because it's not very exciting. Now, when we talk about landmarks, we do have all of that, you know, as our map-based layer. It's quite interactive. But I think the key thing here is people want to understand where they are in relation to the incident. So we do have a handy little Find Me button. And if you do have your location settings turned on, it will find you and plot you on the map. However, if you do just type in your address, that will come up organically as well. So that was a bit about Emergency WA. I just wanted to also give you a bit of an idea about where we're going in Western Australia in terms of public information. So we do have a very large project running at the moment called the Next Gen Warnings Project. And that really will, what we are saying, revolutionise public information here in WA. So we have already rolled out that new website that you just saw now, showing real-time and predictive hazard information, road closures and evacuation centres. A lot of what we do here in this research package will help inform where we go with that predictive mapping, how it will be displayed, how we will push that to people, what messaging will go behind it. So that's why it's super critical that we're in this space. We are looking at introducing two-way communication. So what that means is that for the first time, people will be able to, in a live sense, tell us what they're doing in relation to the incident. So are they leaving? Are they staying? Are they in danger? You know, do they need more information? So it's really about understanding what the community are doing with that messaging. We have just implemented Australian warning system across all of our natural hazards. So that's another part of our project. We have now got better integration with key data sources. Where it's getting exciting is that we are launching an app this year, which will allow people to customize their alert zones and notifications, which in itself is great, but it also brings a lot of attention to the warnings in the fact that people will now have them in the palm of their hands. So what we put on those warnings, and, you know, even to the littlest amount of detail, like in some of our research that we did, it showed that people perceived where the icon was on the map was where the actual fire was. That's not always the case. It could just be where the first 000 call could have came from. But it just means that what we do in the back end and how we position our maps and make them look has such a big impact just from public perception. Lastly, we have a keen focus on ensuring all of our information is accessible and available despite any of the abilities that people may have. So we are focused on providing better access to information for people from cold backgrounds, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, and those with a disability. So lots of exciting things happening here in WA, and we're really excited to be part of this project and continue to see where this leads. So thank you.
All right, thanks, Deanna. So this is actually a great segue, because a lot of our current work packages are using a WA scenario, especially because you can see the importance that WA places on having research to inform their decisions. So the whole project is structured around trying to provide evidence about 6 design principles. These were originally developed based on a literature review about what we did already know about hazard mapping. So I won't sort of go through each of these in turn. That could be a whole webinar in and of itself. But the work package, phase 2 of the project is really focused on testing principles 2, 3, and 4 in the current work we're doing. Principle 5 is something that we'll test later in phase 2. And then principles 1 and 6 we're kind of testing in many different ways because we're running studies in different modes. And I'll show you some examples here that will illustrate some of the different contexts. So we took all of the findings from work packages 4, which is what Erica will tell you about in a webinar in September, and work package 5, which Paula told you about today. And we used the feedback that people gave about maps to inform the design of a whole bunch of options for how we could try and show these fire spread predictions. So what you're looking at here is what we tested in work package 9. So these are 20 different maps. We also tested 2 incident warning maps as kind of a control. And they have different variants of the symbols that we're using to show the fire spread predictions. These are isochrones, so they're telling you how far the fire is predicted to get by a certain point in time. Some of them have evacuation routes on them, some of them don't. And some of them have additional information given to help people self-localize, so understand where they are on the map in relation to the fire risk. So we tested all of these to try and figure out which one might be best to take forward into future studies. We have been torturing the steering committee every 2 weeks with a tool called Miro, where we ask them a lot of questions and get their input and their feedback on things that they think will or won't work. This is just to give you a flavor for what some of this looked like when we were developing these 20 maps. These were a bunch of options that we were considering using, and you can see there's all these sticky notes that the steering committee members have provided their views and their experiences that were relevant to some of these concepts that we were considering. So this just gives you an insight into the process. Okay, so the work package 9 study where we tested these 20 concepts, we delivered or disseminated, we used a dissemination mode of Facebook posts in this case, because that's one way these maps could potentially be distributed in the future. So you can see here in this post, we've got some wording that was workshopped with the steering committee to try and communicate to people what is the purpose of this map, what they should be paying attention to in the map, what it can and can't tell them about. You can also see a legend. So these features here on the side, these were all informed design features that appear in this map that were informed by what we heard in the work package 5 findings. So needing to use a legend, communicating clearly about when a map was issued, for example, how fast the fire is tracking, which you can see from the isochrones on the map, showing key landmarks, things like the evacuation centers, and also forced labeling particularly important roads. Because every one of you who has used a map on your phone knows that the map, the street location that you most want to know, the street name, it's never the one that's shown on the map, right? So in this case, we were trying to deliberately force a map to show those important street names to help people self-localize. We showed evacuation routes to help people get out of the area. And we paid attention to things like sizing and legibility of the features to make sure that people could really read these maps well. Paula has just undertaken a bunch of focus groups in the last couple of weeks. These are maps that you can see that we used in the focus groups. Interesting here for you to see is that we've applied the same design in different contexts. So you can see that because the physical environment of Australia is quite different in different places, the symbols look a bit different against the background. And so this is one way of us getting evidence about whether or not this design that we are proposing will work very well across different physical environments in the base map that's being used. This is a different dissemination mode. It was maps that might be distributed at a community meeting. And so you can see that the information around the edges also looks quite different. And it's also importantly consistent with the kinds of information that each of those jurisdictions would be communicating in these maps. So that also helps us to understand something about different operational practices and where we can make things work well for the emergency management agencies. And then upcoming work is some work that's going to use some eye tracking that will record where people are looking. We'll also be asking them to think aloud. And so they will tell us what they're thinking while they're reading the maps. These are scenario-based experiments where we have a fire event that develops over 5 time points. There's 5 different warnings that are issued. One of the key things that we're examining in this first study is we're going to have one group of people who only see the warning maps, and then one group of maps, or one group of people that sees the warning maps and the predictions. And our key question that we're answering here is, do people with the prediction information make a decision to take a protective action more quickly? Because that's really what we're aiming to do with these maps, to give people the information that they need to avoid delay, to avoid milling, to actually take those protective actions that we know will be helpful. We're also able in this particular study to study these maps in an interactive context. So we've built a simulated emergency WA. This isn't exactly what it looks like, but it gives you a flavor for it. And in that, they will be able to zoom in and out in the map. We'll be able to see how much they're zooming, how much they're panning around, how much they get lost in the map, all of those kinds of things. And this is one way that WA is considering delivering these maps as a layer here in their platform. So we'll be able to see, are people turning layers off and on? How easily are they comprehending this information when it's delivered in this kind of context? A second eye tracking experiment is going to look at the aspect of the temporal precision of the prediction. So currently, the maps we've been testing have these 3 isochrones, so they show the fire's progress for 0 to 6 hours, 6 to 12 hours, and 12 to 24. In this study, we're actually going to just show one polygon that's 0 to 24 and look and see, do people delay decisions more if we give them less temporally granular information? So is that temporal granularity important? Also here in this study, we're going to show road closures rather than evacuation routes to test whether there's a difference there. And we'll be able to take some of the data from this study and some of the data from the previous study and compare them with each other to compare the effect of road closures versus evacuation routes and to see how behaviors change or intended behaviors change in that context. Phase 2, after we've done all of that work and we think about what it means and what it means for the design and iterate on the design, we'll be doing some interviews with groups who have particular accessibility challenges, so called groups, people with particular disabilities, etc. That's work package 11, and then we'll do another national survey, work package 12. And then from all of that, we'll have kind of a final design, final set of principles, and we'll figure out how we can translate that into tools that can really be used by agencies to then try and implement and build these maps. So that's kind of a preview of where we've come from, a snapshot of where we're at, and a little bit of a view into the future where we're going in this project. I'd like to thank NHRA for giving us this opportunity to tell the community about our project, to thank all of the team members who've worked on this project, and also the steering committee for the amazing support that they have given us to actually do this project and produce information that will be useful for helping people understand the role of maps in bushfire incidents.
Thank you, Amy, Paula, and Deana. That is great to see this work. I've been along seeing this work unfold and to see results and next steps and where it's got to during this time is fantastic. So we do have time for some questions. So think through your questions for the team. We have some coming through Q&A. So I'll start with some that is shared with Q&A, and I've got a couple of broad questions for the team as well. But I'll start with Georgina's question. I do have a broad answer to this one, so if you don't have an answer to this question, I can respond to it in a broad way. But Georgina's asking if the Predictions in Public project has been informed in any way by a piece of work and a report that was done called Black Summer, How the New South Wales Community Responded to the 2019-2020 bushfire season, that provided some really good findings around warnings. So did anyone want to speak directly to that, or I can give a broader answer?
I mean, the short answer is yes, and Blythe, you're welcome to fill that in with some more detail.
Okay, yes. So the answer is yes. I can't give you the detail of exactly how, but I do know in two ways. So those evidence-based principles that Amy put, some of those up, they're based on a lit review that was done right at the start of Predictions in Public project that went and looked at a whole lot of work around the use of maps in this area. Reviewing work that's done in Australia as well as internationally, and that was the type of report that was referenced into that lit review. And also, and this speaks to how important having that engaged steering committee is to this project. That was a piece of work that was done for the New South Wales RFS, and the key people from the RFS who worked with that team on that project are actually have been on the steering committee for this project. So there's a very direct correlation there through the people involved in that work. And that report is you can actually access it from the Natural Hazards Research Australia website, I believe, or Bushfire Natural Hazard CRC. That was led by Josh Whittaker, Kat Haynes, and others. So yes, short answer is yes. Thanks, Georgina. And I have a question now then for you, Deana, and this is about the use and rollout of the Australian warning system in WA, and around community education, any community education you're doing about that rollout in Western Australia.
Sure. So yes, we are doing a lot of community education, and specifically our big focus is on the northern part of the state. So we are changing a decades-long cyclone system from blue, yellow, red alerts to advice, watch and act, emergency warning. So that is a big change for them. It has implications for industry. We've got a big mining sector up in the northwest of the state, which relies on basically our warnings to shut down multi-million-dollar sites. So it's a big change, and a lot of stakeholder engagement has gone into those areas. We have also done, we've got campaigns running now and into summer, so we'll try and bolster the public's awareness. We've done a lot of engagement with local governments through our regional offices, via media, and we'll continue to do so, really. This is not going to be a tick a box and see you later. It's a ongoing consultation and awareness that we have changed the warning system. With the delivery of our app later in the year, we'll of course get new people following that probably haven't ever been on Emergency WA, but now that we've got an app, they might be more engaged. So we'll have to educate a whole new cohort of the public who may not even have been engaged with our warnings in the past. I think we can fairly safely say that we get a lot of engagement from the community when emergencies affect them. So if we have a bushfire or another hazard in a densely populated area, we see the numbers of people coming to our website exponentially increase. So, just organically we'll get people who are engaged in our warnings and then start to understand the warning system as it is now. But look, short answer is yes. I think there was a second part to your question, which was, does it inform any of the changes that you make? I think, again, like I said, one person's opinion doesn't sort of shape the whole way that we do things, but we do take on everybody's feedback. And if it's sort of starting to trend, that we see that there are a number of people commenting on the same thing, then we will have discussions around how we might be able to have some quick wins. I was part of the Kimberley floods incident that happened last year, which cut off basically multiple towns in our Kimberley region. And just a very quick story, I won't take up too much of your time. But yeah, there was a lot of feedback around how we could effectively change the flood warnings because they just weren't, basically our flood warnings are all about evacuate now, but we were in a situation where people were isolated. They had nowhere to go. So, you know, we did make a couple of changes on the fly that actually did have negative impacts on some of our other platforms and services. So I think to me, that was a big wake-up call to say, we really shouldn't be making these decisions at the coalface when things are happening. This is the sort of stuff that needs to happen now, you know, in that sort of a bit of a lull period, but also through these discussions on how to inform where we're headed, not just tomorrow, but in the next 6 to 12 months.
Thanks. Connected to that, I'll go back to the Q&A panel in a moment. I have a broad question because I know this has been raised in when we have talked about this project and shared information about it with stakeholders, a question that comes up. So it flows on from that, Deana, so I might give you first chance to answer, but I'm sure Paula and Amy will have something to say as well, is about the applicability of this project and the research you're doing to other hazards as well as bushfire, because I know there is potential for learning around use of maps and predictive maps in other contexts and for other hazards like floods, not just bushfire. And I know that's been a topic of conversation, so I might throw to you first, Deana, and then Amy and Paula, of the potential you see for this research to inform predictive maps in other hazards.
Yeah, sure. So look, as I'm guilty of it myself, I talk about bushfire all the time, and we're a multi-hazard agency. So we have to keep in the back of our minds, we also deal with very devastating floods, cyclones, and other hazards. So I think whatever we do for one hazard, we should be able to do for other hazards where possible. So if we do have information that is going to determine where the community may be affected next, or where the hazard's headed, and I mean, we go back to the there was a question about rain, there was a question about wind direction and speed. We also do on our layers have an opportunity for people to layer on the cyclone track maps. So that basically shows people, here's the forecast of where the cyclone will be, not just tomorrow, but, you know, in the next 6 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours. I mean, I think essentially that is already doing that for that hazard, because it's showing you this is where we're expected it to be. If you're in this community, it's probably time to start doing something. So I think we always need to keep that in the back of our minds. And I think whatever we do for one hazard, we should be able to do for the others.
I think that there's a tension in trying to make one design work for all hazards. It won't, because the events themselves have different physical and spatial characteristics. So it is really challenging, I think, to design a platform that can accommodate all of those things at once. And it's just a simple example. On many platforms that show bushfire maps, there's an area that indicates kind of the burned area of the fire, right? And oftentimes that's, if it's in a multi-hazard platform, it's labeled as something like incident area. And so when people look at that, they don't actually understand that it is a burned area. They're like, what is an incident area? Is the fire burning there, that whole place right now? In fact, it's actually a place where the fire isn't burning anymore, but has burned in the past. So that can cause confusion for participants. So there are challenges, I think, to visually communicating hazards that are idiosyncratic to each hazard, and navigating the balance of where do you standardize and where do you not standardize, I think is a challenging thing. Paula, did you have something to add?
The only thing I wanted to add to that is I think agencies are under a lot of strain because private sector is just going to come in and potentially offer that. And they might be doing it as discrete agencies, like you have flood mapping, you've got bushfires, but government unfortunately has to do all of the things. So if you want your community going there with the potential of different types of information credibility, you got to think about what's our response to that in the community.
Great, thanks. So we've got some questions here about, I'll throw to one that you might want to answer this, Amy, because you spoke to about the testing that's going to be done, future test done with called community other users of maps. So somebody's asking here how the interpretation and modification of maps for called community can be accommodated when warnings are still predominantly in English.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know about the warning translation. I don't know. There may be translation that happens in jurisdictions. I actually can't speak to that. But we can think about whether the symbols that we use on maps are things that will communicate without words. So a lot of people do associate the color red with danger, although that is a culturally conditioned association. And it doesn't necessarily persist across every culture. Chinese culture, red is actually a happy, positive color, not a color of danger, right? So it's not universal. But people do have a semantic association of red with fire. So you can try and draw on symbols that work with those semantic connections. So that's one thing that one can do. Another thing that I can point to in our current version of the design is we started showing the evacuation routes actually as a blue line, because that's how Google and Apple Maps and all those tools that people use all the time show that route. They show your route as blue. Of course, a problem with that is when you zoom out on the map, it kind of looks like a river, right? We actually don't want people to be confused that that's a river. So we ended up landing on a green color that is the same color as the evacuation center symbol, and also has this connotation of green means go from a traffic light perspective. So one can definitely draw on those kinds of associations of color with daily life, and to try and use icons that are things that are commonly understood even among people who speak different languages, for example. So those are the things that I think we could do visually in the map. Maybe Deana can talk to what happens with text warnings. I don't actually have much knowledge about how that works.
Yeah, I would love to throw to Deana, and we have some other questions to answer, but with an eye on time, we won't be able to do that. But we will, just to let people know, I've put answers in the Q&A. We will pass them on to the team to have a look at, and we might see if we can do a little follow-up to some of the questions when we come back to you with the recording in future. So just before we wrap up though, if you're interested in learning more about predictive bushfire maps and this project, as we said, there is another hazardous webinar that's sharing results from qualitative interviews with communities led by Dr. Erica Kulagowski from RMIT University. That will be in September on the 17th. We'll share with you registration information for that webinar when we share this recording around with you. I want to say a huge thank you to the panelists for your time and your expertise and your commitment to this project, and also to everyone who's joined us online today. Just to let you know, we will have another hazardous webinar next month, looking at enhancing decision-making in emergency management. We'll also be at AFAP 24, the conference in Sydney. So you're welcome to come around and visit our booth and talk more about projects. We can link you up with researchers at the AFAP conference as well. And for updates on everything Natural Hazards Research Australia related, you can sign up to our newsletter and follow us on social media, where we share information about upcoming webinars. So thank you all for your time and your attention today. And thanks again, Paula, Amy, and Deana. It has been a pleasure. And we'll see you all next time.